In November 2008, Bernard Madoff Investment Securities reported assets worth $68 billion to clients in North America, Europe, and Latin America. Just days later, however, 5,000 direct investors and untold thousands of others with funds invested with Madoff saw their investments collapse in what may have been the single largest fraud of any kind in history. Mr. Toastmaster, members and guests, today I'm going to talk to you about financial fraud. What it is, some notable examples, some recommendations to reduce the risk of fraud, and some few insights about fraud. What is fraud? Well, fraud is any illegal act characterized by deceit, concealment, or violation of trust. Fraud is not dependent upon violence or the threat of physical violence. Frauds are perpetrated by people and organizations to get money, property, or services, to avoid payment or loss of services, or to secure a personal or business advantage. Now, financial fraud, especially Ponzi schemes, is a significant problem. And despite the fact that every time we hear about fraud, there seems to be additional controls to try to prevent their reoccurrence, we continue to see thousands of people lose tremendous amounts of money, sometimes their entire life savings to fraud. Businesses aren't exempt from fraud either. Now, while Bernard Madoff's fraud was the largest, unfortunately it wasn't the only notorious example. Just last year, Alan Stanford of Stanford Financial Group was charged by the SEC with multiple violations of the SEC laws and fraud for a fraud involving some $8 billion in certificates of deposit. Now, as a reminder, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission is an independent federal agency that oversees the financial services industry in the U.S. and is responsible for enforcing securities laws. Now, what would a talk about fraud be without remembering the father of the Ponzi scheme, Carlo Ponzi? Now, Carlo Ponzi told investors they could reap a 40% return in just 90 days. He convinced investors that he could capitalize on the buying and selling of what was then called international mail coupons. He could capitalize them by buying mail coupons in depressed countries at a low price and selling them for a higher price in a prosperous country. Get this, in 1921, Carlo Ponzi was inundated with funds from investors, taking in $1 million, which is the equivalent of $12 million today, in just one 3-hour time period. Now, since efforts to prevent fraud haven't been successful, is there anything we can do about this? Absolutely. I think a three-pronged approach can help. 1, through additional regulations and enforcement. 2, individual investors have to take better care of themselves. And 3, businesses must take additional steps too. Here are 3 recommendations for additional regulations and enforcement. 1, require all investment advisors who must register with the SEC to use an independent and certified custodian. Now, in investment terms, a custodian is a financial services company who maintain the records of the financial investments. A custodian should be independent from the investment advisors. Secondly, require hedge fund advisors to register with the SEC who manage more than $30 million, regardless of the number of clients they have. Today, only hedge fund advisors who manage more than 15 clients must register. Now, hedge funds use aggressive investment techniques prohibited by mutual funds, like borrowing money, selling short, or use of stock options. And hedge funds are currently exempt from many regulations today. Third, create a multi-source reporting and cross-checking system within the SEC, similar to what the IRS has in place today for income. Today, if you work for an employer, your income is reported to the IRS, and this is checked against the income you report on your tax return. A similar process for investment advisors would allow the SEC to determine more effectively whether any of the investments reported are real or not. Next, individuals have to protect themselves better. Here's a couple of recommendations. If the investment opportunity seems too good to be true, it likely is too good to be true. If the investment can't be explained so that you readily understand it, be suspicious. Keep asking questions. Don't listen to pitches claiming it's impossible to explain the deal in layman's terms. If the opportunity is secret with very limited participation, run. Check with your state securities regulator or the SEC to see whether the person offering this investment is registered or not, or has a disciplinary history. Be alert to unexpected telephone calls, emails, or personal visits from strangers, even friends, who offer quick profit schemes requiring immediate action. Don't be pressured to act quickly. Ask for detailed information in writing. Get information on the company, its officers, its investment track record. And do some investigating yourself. Be skeptical of investments where all the banking transactions or bookkeeping are handled in some remote city or country. And be suspicious of investors who are reluctant to allow you to cash in any gains. Now, as for businesses, their auditors should verify whether their assets exist or not, their values, if material, and the collectability of these assets and their rates of return. And employers should educate their employees, too, on how to avoid becoming victims of financial fraud. I'll pass around a list of these recommendations to you after the talk. Now, in large part, these recommendations come from two sources. First is the annual Kroll Global Fraud Report. Now, Kroll is a large multinational risk consulting company. And second, from an article written by Joseph Wells, who's the chairman of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. Now, these two sources had a couple of other interesting observations on fraud. First, the Kroll report showed that during a recession, it's the discovery of fraud that arises. You see, just like legitimate businesses, fraudsters are threatened by the loss of income or weaknesses in their business. Second, recent scams uncovered have mostly been Ponzi schemes, which are especially vulnerable during recession. And while there's different types of Ponzi schemes, they all have one thing in common. The victims all share a common trait with the scam artists, which makes an investor trust the con artist more. Third, last year, multiple scams targeted very specific groups. High net worth income residents of New York City or Palm Beach. Investors from certain religious faiths, such as members of the Mormon or Jewish communities. Many of Bernie Madoff's victims were Jewish. And Jewish groups weren't the only groups targeted. Scams also hit members of certain ethnic groups, be it Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, or Haitian Americans, excuse me. And sadly, elderly and the folks with disabilities were also targeted. Lastly, businesses were also victims of fraud too. The Kroll report found that the hardest hit industry for fraud and wrongdoing was the financial services industry. Nearly 90% of surveyed financial services firms reported being victims of fraud in the last 3 years. Making the problem worse was the fact that 21% of these financial services firms saw their internal controls weakened through cost cutting. Now, in summary, financial fraud, especially Ponzi schemes, is a significant problem. However, a three-pronged approach can help. 1, additional financial regulations and enforcement. 2, individual investors must take better care of themselves. And 3, businesses must take additional steps too. Before I finish, I want to share with you an interesting quote I came across while researching this for fraud. It's from John Kenneth Galbraith, the famous American economist. He wrote, "The man who is admired for the ingenuity of his larceny is almost always rediscovering some earlier form of fraud. The basic forms are all known, have all been practiced. The manners of capitalism improve, the morals may not." Mr. Toastmaster.